Amelia stepped off the bustling city bus, her worn-out sneakers brushing against the cracked pavement. The evening air carried a mix of distant laughter and the hum of streetlights flickering to life. She clutched a faded leather bag tightly against her side, its contents as fragile as her resolve. For weeks she'd been circling the edges of a world she didn't belong to, trying to find an opening, a chance to rewrite the script of her life. Tonight she stood outside the Haven, a high-end restaurant notorious not just for its exclusivity, but for the secrets it hid behind its gilded doors. The kind of secrets that could ruin lives, or change them forever. Amelia wasn't here for dinner. She wasn't dressed for it, anyway. Her jeans were frayed, her sweater stretched from years of wear. But what she carried inside that bag could make her someone who mattered, even if only for one night. Inside the glowing facade of the Haven, wealthy patrons sipped on drinks that cost more than Amelia's monthly rent. Beyond the main dining area, behind locked doors and velvet ropes, was a room where deals were whispered, alliances forged, and promises broken. Amelia had spent countless nights observing from the shadows, and now, for reasons she hadn't fully processed, she decided tonight was the night she'd cross the line. But as she reached for the ornate door handle, a voice from behind stopped her cold. "You shouldn't be here." It was low, calm, but commanding enough to send a chill down her spine. Turning slowly, Amelia met the piercing gaze of a man who seemed to know far too much about what she was planning, and why. And just like that, the choice Amelia thought she had suddenly slipped through her fingers. Amelia's breath caught as the man stepped closer, his sharp features illuminated by the golden glow spilling from the restaurant. He was tall, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, and carried an air of authority that made her pulse quicken. His eyes flickered briefly to her bag, as though he already knew what was inside. She instinctively clutched it tighter, her heart pounding against her rib cage. I don't think this concerns you," she stammered, though her voice betrayed more fear than defiance. She tried to step back, but he moved to block her path with a kind of ease that suggested he had done this before. "Oh, it concerns me more than you think," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You have no idea what you're walking into. Or maybe you do, and that's even worse." His words struck a nerve, but Amelia refused to show it. She had spent months piecing this plan together, risking everything just to get this far. She wasn't about to let a stranger stop her, no matter how intimidating he seemed. But something about his tone made her hesitate. He didn't sound like he wanted to threaten her. He sounded like he was trying to warn her. "Who are you?" she asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Instead of answering, he glanced toward the restaurant, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. Then he leaned in just enough for his voice to drop to a whisper. "If you open that door, you won't get the second chance you're hoping for. People in there play a different kind of game, and you're not ready for it." Amelia's grip on the bag tightened. She knew there was no turning back now. But as the man's words lingered in her mind, she couldn't help but wonder if he was right. Amelia's pulse raced as she locked eyes with the man. There was something unsettlingly familiar about him, though she couldn't quite place it. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the storm raging in her mind. He hadn't answered her question, and his cryptic warning only deepened her unease. "I didn't come this far to turn back," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "Whatever game they're playing in there, I can handle it." The man's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "It's not just a game," he said. "It's a test. And if you fail, there are no do-overs. You think they'll let someone like you walk away unscathed?" He paused, his eyes narrowing as if weighing whether to tell her more. "What's in that bag isn't just your ticket in, it's their leverage. Once they have it, you lose control." Amelia stiffened, his words striking closer to the truth than she cared to admit. The bag held everything: documents, photos, and pieces of a puzzle she had worked tirelessly to assemble. Proof of what the Haven wasn't just hiding but protecting. If she was right, exposing it could bring powerful people to their knees. If she was wrong, it could destroy her life. "I don't need your advice," she said, though her voice faltered slightly. She stepped past him, her hand brushing the cold metal of the door handle. But before she could push it open, the man spoke again, his tone darker this time. "Amelia," he said, and the sound of her name froze her in place. "You're not the only one watching them. And if you go in there without knowing who's really pulling the strings, you won't just be fighting them. You'll be fighting me." She turned, stunned, but the man was already walking away, his silhouette swallowed by the shadows. Her grip on the door tightened, uncertainty clawing at her resolve. She thought she was ready for whatever lay ahead, but now she wasn't so sure. Amelia hesitated, her fingers hovering over the handle. The man's words echoed in her mind, unsettling and insistent. She didn't have time to dwell on his cryptic warning. Every second spent outside the door was a second closer to losing her chance. Taking a shaky breath, she pushed it open. The shift was immediate. The warmth of the Haven's lobby gave way to a colder, more calculated atmosphere. The room beyond wasn't like the elegant dining area she had passed earlier. This was different, quieter, heavier, as if the walls themselves held secrets. Men in tailored suits and women in dresses that whispered wealth glanced up briefly, their gazes sharp, assessing, before returning to hushed conversations. Amelia's presence barely caused a ripple, which was exactly what she had hoped for. She made her way to the far end of the room, where a cluster of people surrounded a man seated at a polished mahogany table. His presence was magnetic, his voice low but commanding, pulling everyone into his orbit. This was Julian Locke, the one name that kept surfacing during her months of digging. Julian's reputation preceded him. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a puppeteer, pulling strings that stretched far beyond what anyone could see. If half of what Amelia had uncovered was true, Julian wasn't just involved in the scandal. He was its architect. She slipped into a corner, her hand resting protectively over her bag. Her plan was simple: get close enough to plant the evidence, then walk away unnoticed. But as she observed Julian's effortless control over the room, doubt crept in. People like him didn't just fall. They crushed anyone who tried to stand in their way. "Can I help you?" A voice jolted her, smooth but suspicious. A woman with piercing eyes and a clipboard stood before her, blocking her view of Julian. Amelia's heart jumped as she scrambled for an excuse, but before she could respond, the woman's gaze dropped to the bag. "Let's see what you've brought us," she said, her smile anything but friendly. Amelia's chest tightened. She hadn't even unzipped the bag, but somehow it felt like her secrets were already exposed. Amelia froze, her mind racing as the woman's fingers hovered just inches from the bag. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Her plan relied on slipping in and out unnoticed, but now all eyes seemed to be inching toward her. She tightened her grip on the strap and forced a shaky smile. "It's nothing," she said, stepping back. "Just personal belongings." The woman tilted her head, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Personal belongings don't usually end up in rooms like this. Why don't we check?" Her tone was casual, but the edge in her voice was unmistakable. Before Amelia could react, a sudden shift in the room's energy made the air crackle. "Is there a problem here?" Julian Locke's voice cut through the tension, smooth and deliberate. The crowd parted as he approached, his presence like a force field that commanded attention. Amelia's heart sank as his piercing gaze landed on her. Up close, he was even more intimidating than she imagined, his every movement radiating control. "Just verifying our guest's intentions," the woman replied, her smile returning, but now tinged with deference. Julian's eyes flicked from her to Amelia, his expression unreadable. "Leave us," he said simply, and the woman hesitated for just a moment before stepping back into the shadows. Amelia's pulse pounded as Julian gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, the bag now feeling like an anchor in her lap. "You don't look like one of my regulars," he said, his voice calm but probing. "So, tell me, what brings you here tonight?" Before she could answer, the door to the room swung open with a sharp creak. Every head turned as the man from earlier strode in, his gaze locking onto Amelia. "She's not here for dinner," he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs. "And you know exactly why she's here." Amelia's stomach twisted as Julian's calm facade slipped, his eyes narrowing at the man. "You've been meddling again," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. "I warned you to stay out of this." The man smirked, his confidence unshaken. "And I warned you your little empire wouldn't last forever." Amelia felt trapped between the two men, their standoff crackling with unspoken tension. Julian's gaze returned to her, colder now, as if seeing her in a new light. "You brought him here?" he asked, his voice icy. "No," Amelia stammered, her mind scrambling for answers. But before she could explain, Julian leaned back, a sinister smile creeping onto his face. "Then I guess it's time we find out just how much she knows." Amelia's grip tightened on the bag as the walls seemed to close in, the stakes higher than ever, and no way to escape unscathed. Amelia's heart raced as Julian's icy smile sent chills down her spine. The room felt suffocating, every gaze now pinned on her. She opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but the man who had warned her earlier stepped forward, cutting her off. "She doesn't know as much as you think," he said, his voice steady but layered with something Amelia couldn't place. "But if you harm her, you'll be proving everything I've been telling them about you." His eyes darted to the group still lingering in the corners, their whispered conversations now replaced by uneasy silence. Julian chuckled, the sound low and menacing. "You always did have a flair for theatrics. But let's be honest, this isn't about her, is it?" His gaze shifted back to Amelia, his smile fading. "What's in the bag?" Amelia's grip tightened as she finally found her voice. "Proof," she said, her words shaky but defiant. "Proof that you've been laundering money through fake charities. Proof that you've ruined lives to protect your own." The room tensed, the weight of her accusation hanging in the air. Julian's expression darkened, and for the first time a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. But before he could respond, the man stepped between them. "She's not bluffing," he said, his voice sharp. "I made sure of it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small recording device, holding it up for everyone to see. "You should have been more careful about who you trusted, Julian." The shock rippled through the room, but Julian recovered quickly, his cold smile returning. "And what do you think this will accomplish?" he sneered. "You think you're the first to try and bring me down?" Amelia stood, her courage swelling despite the fear twisting in her gut. "Maybe not," she said, her voice stronger now. "But we'll be the last." The doors burst open, and Amelia's heart leapt as uniformed officers flooded the room. Julian's face twisted into rage as he realized the game was over. The man next to Amelia stepped back, letting the officers take control, his calm demeanor never faltering. As Julian was led away in handcuffs, Amelia turned to the man. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. He hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Let's just say I've been waiting for someone brave enough to finish what I started." Before she could press him further, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving her standing alone with the weight of everything that had just happened. The bag slipped from her shoulder, the burden finally lifted, but the mystery of the man lingered. As Amelia stepped outside into the crisp night air, she realized she wasn't just walking away from Julian's world, she was stepping into her own. The story wasn't over. It was only beginning. Amelia stood on the quiet street, her breath visible in the cool night air. The tension that had gripped her for so long was finally easing, replaced by a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. She watched as the flashing lights of the police cars faded into the distance, Julian's arrest marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The weight of the bag on her shoulder was gone, but its significance lingered. Everything she'd worked for had led to this moment, and now she wasn't sure what came next. Her mind wandered to the man who had intervened. He'd been more than a stranger. He had known exactly when and how to tip the scales in her favor. But why? His cryptic parting words replayed in her head, and she realized that while Julian was no longer a threat, the man's motives were still a mystery. She knew better than to expect answers, but his involvement felt far from over. Walking toward the bus stop, Amelia glanced back at the glowing facade of the Haven. It looked the same as it had before, luxurious, untouchable, but now she knew better. Beneath its polished exterior lay a web of secrets, many of which were still untangled. Tonight had been a victory, but it was only a small dent in a much larger machine. As she sat on the bench waiting for her bus, Amelia felt a quiet sense of resolve. She had faced fear, risked everything, and come out stronger. Whatever the future held, she knew she could handle it. The world was still full of shadows, but now she understood her place in it, a light, however small, willing to shine where it mattered most. And for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to move forward.